Is socialism to blame for the situation in Venezuela? I'm DONNA Davis, and this is Scholars Mate. Hello, and welcome to Scholars Mate. I'm your host, DONNA Davis. As the economic situation in Venezuela continues to worsen, many are wondering whether the country's socialist policies begun under the late former President Hugo Chavez are the cause of the nation's maladies. Others, however, argue that the matter is more complicated and that there are other factors to play. So, how much is socialism to blame for Venezuela's ills? Joining us to discuss this issue via Skype is Gabriel Hetland, Assistant Professor of Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino Studies and Sociology at the State University of New York at Albany. He received his PhD in Sociology from the University at California at Berkeley in 2015. He's finishing a book entitled Making Democracy Real: Participatory Governance in Urban Latin America, and has been published in numerous scholarly journals and popular press outlets. And joining us in the studio is Ray Walser, a veteran Foreign Service officer and former senior policy analyst specializing in Latin America at the Heritage Foundation. Before entering the Foreign Service, he taught courses in European history, international relations, and Western civilization at Bluefield College in Virginia. He earned his doctorate at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and has testified before Congress numerous times on Latin America. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us.
And thank you, Donna.
Thank you very much.
So, Dr. Walser, are socialist principles to blame for the situation in Venezuela?
Donna, I think that's a very tough, a very fair sort of question. The problem is socialism is such a broad term, covering everything from sort of the extreme right of the past, National Socialism, all the way across the spectrum, from the center, all the way to communism on the right. So what socialism, to a certain degree, are we talking about? I think what we're talking about at this particular point is obviously a variant, a Latin American variant of socialism, called sort of 21st century socialism, or the Bolivarian Revolution, or some people would refer to it as Chavismo. I think that what we see are the foundations of a socialist idea, an idea, I think, in which the people control the means of production, in which the state plays an important role in redistribution, in the direction of economic policy. But we also see factors of political power. We see in the Bolivarian Revolution Chavez's use of authoritarian means, using democratic tools to basically achieve an authoritarian rule. Basically, at the end of the day, I think that what you have is a sort of divided, heart-mind situation, in which I think, yes, perhaps the Chavista heart is a set of socialist principles. However, the mind that controls and drives the body is largely a sort of political power base that has entrenched the regime and is oftentimes more interested in political power and survival than in actually implementing socialism.
And Dr. Hetland, how do you respond to Dr. Walser's comments?
So I'll start by agreeing with what Dr. Walser is saying, in the sense that I think socialism is a very broad subject and it's been defined in a number of different ways. So the way I understand it is somewhat simple definition is a form of economic and political democracy where organized communities at the base level have control over decisions affecting their lives. And so that's something that has rarely been achieved anywhere in capitalist countries like our own, or in so-called socialist countries. To varying degrees, it has been achieved in certain places. So from that standpoint, I don't think that it is possible to talk about Venezuela under Chavez as socialist, particularly if we're thinking about socialism as a sort of total state or social control over the means of production, the private sector during the Chavez years and continuing under Maduro still has tremendous control over economic decision-making and over property. Over 70% of property remains in private hands in Venezuela. So the sense of Venezuela as being sort of socialist in any classical definition of it is not something that I would agree with. So going to one of Dr. Walser's points in terms of Venezuela under Chavez being an authoritarian state, that's one I respectively would disagree with, although I do think there's plenty to criticize of the Chavez and Maduro regimes. But to characterize Chavez as authoritarian, I think, overlooks the fact that Chavez was repeatedly affirmed in very free and fair elections. The Carter Center called the Venezuelan system the best electoral system in the world. And I've gone down there actually and done audits on it myself and been able to see that it's a very sort of foolproof system from the point of view of electoral fraud. And there's a series of repeated elections from 1998 through the present where Chavez and his ruling party, originally the Fifth Republic movement and then the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, won usually by very large majorities. So having said that, I do think that there's plenty to criticize in terms of the government's actions. And I certainly wouldn't say that they're beyond reproach. Some of their more recent actions do lead in a more authoritarian direction. So I think if we distinguish between Chavez and the last several months, there's some differences that we might want to make.
So, Dr. Walser, how do you respond to Dr. Hetland's comments?
Well, I think he is minimizing the authoritarian aspects because, as we know, governance is much more than just elections. One of the things that Chavez was very good at figuring out was how to win elections, how to use state resources, how to build. Clearly, he built a popular base, and there's no denying that he managed. But he would manage sort of state assets, controls of the media. Okay, he is at one point he does not get his he does lose one referendum on presidential term limits. He comes back, maneuvers his way, gets a second referendum that allows him to sort of continue his rule. The last election that elects Maduro was a razor-thin sort of margin in which the allegations, particularly of use of state resources, control of access to media and the like, I think threw into question the quote-unquote legitimacy of the election. So the gutting largely of the Constitution, the current efforts to basically marginalize the Chamber of Deputies or the Legislative Assembly, the stonewalling of the referendum recall, these are not healthy signs of a democracy.
You're referring to political aspects of the country's governance. But I think also part of the discussion is more on the ground, what is happening in terms of the stability of the country of Venezuela. Dr. Hetland, could you talk a little bit about the distinction between those two and where you stand on that?
Sure, I think it's a good distinction to make. And just to, very briefly to respond to a couple of the points that Dr. Walser was making there, I think in terms of the media under Chavez, there was an increase in community radio stations. There was an increase to some extent in state media, but the private media did not go away by any means. And so the sort of saying that there was no free speech whatsoever under Chavez, which isn't exactly what he was saying, but saying that there was a dramatic reduction in free speech, overlooks the tremendous criticism that Chavez and Maduro regularly receive from private media within Venezuela. So that's one important point to keep in mind. And then turning very specifically and briefly to the 2013 election, this brings in the role of the opposition, which I think is an important thing to consider because the government's actions are not happening in a vacuum, but they're happening with reference to an opposition which has not itself behaved in democratic ways consistently at all. The opposition waged a completely unconstitutional military coup against the democratically elected President Chavez in 2002. With support of military, they overthrew him for a period of 48 hours, and it was popular mobilization that saw Chavez return. And it's not just the past. In 2014, the opposition waged a sort of very sort of anti-democratic set of street protests over the course of 3 months that resulted in 43 deaths it's important to state that around half of those were government forces, but the other half, through careful research, seemed to be at the opposition's hands. So this is not a perfect, beautiful democratic opposition. But then moving more directly to your question, Donna, I do think it's important to see what's happening on the ground. And there may actually be a lot of places that Dr. Walser and I will agree in terms of the current situation. People in Venezuela are not happy. So a lot of Chavistas or people who are willing to support the government, because of the current very acute, very difficult economic and social crisis that the country is experiencing, the government has lost a massive amount of support. So the popular base that Dr. Walser was referring to, which is undeniable for over a decade and a half really, has considerably eroded in the last several years. At the same time, the opposition doesn't have a whole lot of strength in the sort of grassroots popular sectors, because they haven't offered economic solutions to the current problems that the country is facing. In fact, they've said we can't offer any economic solutions until we take care of the political problem, meaning getting rid of the current democratically elected government, which they refused initially in 2013 to even recognize the legitimacy of Maduro's election. So I think if we're going to be criticizing the government, it's okay to do so, but we need to do it in a careful manner, and we can't leave the opposition off the hook either.
Dr. Walser, if the opposition is part of the problem and the government itself is a central point, a central focus for the problem, where could you begin to look at some solutions for Venezuela?
Well, the first attempt has been a sort of, during the last year, some sort of serious dialogue between the parties with sort of external mediation by the Vatican. There have been a number of efforts, sort of at least conversations about this. I will agree with Dr. Hetland that the opposition has at times not come up with the most constructive sorts of policies, because in many respects, the sorts of policies that would need to be recommended sort of run anathema to the sitting regime. As he has very well articulated in his articles in The Nation and other things, that at the crux of many of the matters are such things as corruption. Well, who generally is the most corrupt elements? I mean, it is the government itself, which we sort of tends to document. Well, if the government is in part the currency, he talks a great deal. I don't want to steal his thunder, but he talks about the disastrous nature of the currency system that was put in, the monetary policies and the exchange systems. Those are government policies. Well, you've got the opposition wants those changed. So, yes, is there a potential for common ground? But if they can't agree on, if opposition and government can't even begin to agree on the sort of fundamentals of what would work to change the equation, then we're going to have a very stalemated and a very difficult situation, which I think we both agree is not going to be, there is no easy solution. Just the disappearance of the Chavez regime, that won't happen. The opposition coming in and tidying things up in a nice way, that's not really going to work either. So we've got to come back to some sort of middle ground area and hope that reason prevails at some point. But I'm not particularly optimistic. I don't know about Dr. Hetland. I think that people were shying away from investing in Venezuela because of the worsening economic situation. Obviously, the declining price of oil, concerns about the nature of the regime.
And Gabriel, how do you respond to that?
Sure. There's some things that I agree with, but for the fun of the viewers, if no one else, I'll stick to a couple points of disagreement. In terms of the media, often the accusation is thrown about in a somewhat general fashion, and I think it's important to, as much as possible, stick to some studies that have happened about media in Venezuela. And again, Mark Weisbrot is one of the people who've done very good empirical studies. I certainly don't agree with him on everything he says, but he did a very compelling study of the media coverage in state-owned media and private-owned media in the 2013 election of Maduro and Capriles. And he found that the state-owned media did more coverage of the opposition, of Capriles, who was the opposition candidate, compared to what private media did of Maduro and the ruling Socialist Party. So there was a disparity, but it wasn't the sort of disparity that you would expect if you looked at sort of this image of Venezuela as authoritarian. And this is really important because the actual amount of viewership for the private channel was something like 3 or 4 times what the public channel was getting. So it could be the case that the public channel is biased towards the government. That wouldn't be surprising, and there would be some legitimate ways to critique that. But if everyone is watching the private media, and the private media are overwhelmingly biased towards the opposition, then it doesn't suggest this image of a totally crippled, non-free press that we're being given over and over again. So I think that's really important to keep in mind.
All right, let's take some questions from our viewers. Christopher Chapman asks, could you provide one example of a socialist country that has prospered? Dr. Walser, I'll let you take that one.
Well, again, it goes to sort of the definitions of socialism. If we talk about sort of democratic socialism, yes, I mean, the Nordic states, European states, which practice sort of at least have succeeded. Socialism, as we generally refer to it, the Soviet Union, certainly did not work. So it's kind of hard to, again, you have to just, sort of redefine what is socialism. Generally, my impression is socialism doesn't work. It doesn't seem to be working in Venezuela. It really didn't work in Cuba. It didn't work in the Soviet Union. But man is ever resourceful and always trying to make socialism work.
Dr. Hetland?
So I think that if you look at Latin America, again, thinking that socialism is a contested definition, but if we take a very broad definition of socialism as just sort of a socialist principle more than socialism itself, as being a sort of attempt to have more state regulation and social policy and more planning over the economy. If we compare basically Latin America as a region in the current left turn, when there's been a number of governments that could be seen as more socialist compared to the 1980s and 90s when there's more market-friendly governments or neoliberal governments, as they're often called. In the 1990s, Venezuela, or the whole Latin America region, had really horrible negative economic growth in a number of countries, rising poverty, rising inequality, whereas from 2002, 2003 until the last couple of years, Latin America overall cut poverty, cut inequality, experienced record levels of economic growth by pursuing policies that much more centered on regulating the market and providing for the poorest members of society. So in that sense, you can point to Brazil, Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, none of which would, strictly speaking, meet a definition of socialism. Venezuela perhaps would come closest, but all of those countries experienced very important periods of growth. Now, Dr. Walser could come back and say, well, socialism seems to have failed in Venezuela, and we could debate the terminology a little bit. And I would say, yes, it is true that Venezuela is in the midst of a very severe crisis, but there's specific policies, currency policies in particular, and certain oil-based policies as well, that don't really have anything to do with socialism per se, or even attempts to regulate the market. And those specific policies are driving the current crisis. So I don't think it's fair to then just sort of jump and say, look, socialism can never work.
We have another question from Jessica Fleming. Why are many of Venezuela's neighbors prospering? They have similar demographic and economic profiles. Dr. Hetland, I'll let you go first this time.
Sure. I mean, I'd want to ask the question writer a little bit which neighbors he or she is speaking about, but it's true that some of the countries in Latin America that neighbor Venezuela have done better in recent years. One country that I have some experience studying is Bolivia, and they have certainly done better. And they've had actually a more conservative fiscal policy over the last years, which many on the left would be critical of. But they've saved more for the rainy day in terms of falling global commodity prices, and that certainly has served them well in the current global recession, starting in 2009, and then again, sort of mini recession over the last couple of years. Whereas Venezuela has not had a successful policy there. So again, I don't think it means socialism is to blame, but certainly Venezuela very much mismanaged its economy, and some other countries in Latin America managed theirs a lot better. I would also say in closing that many countries in Latin America mismanage their economy pretty poorly. So to say that all of Venezuela's neighbors are doing well right now is unfortunately not the reality.
Dr. Walser, how do you respond?
Well, I think right now that Colombia seems to be where a lot of Venezuelans are trying to get to, for one way or the other, either to get scarce goods or to get medical services or simply to escape even to Brazil and the others. I think Colombia is doing a reasonable job. People have a peace agreement there. The economy has, I mean, one of the things is we go back to the sort of, unfortunately, to what all of these nations, whether they're socialist or market-oriented, do depend, particularly because they're commodity-oriented for the most part, do depend upon the price of world commodities, the price of oil and everything like that. Venezuela was unable to wean itself. In fact, it's become more dependent upon oil. Brazil, which is right, people were lifted up out of poverty, more people making to the middle class, poverty reduced, was going through a tremendous sort of commodity boom. I mean, the challenge becomes in governance is applying those socialist principles in a responsible way in trying to eradicate particularly extreme poverty, to try to build your middle class, and to diversify. The challenge becomes continually sort of diversifying economies. Colombia is undertaking that.
Okay, and now it's time for Answer This, where each guest asks a question directly to the other. Who'd like to go first?
I'm happy to go first. Ray, it's been, first of all, really a pleasure speaking to you today. And the question I have, and this is really earnest because I don't know what the solution is, how would you propose fixing the current mess that Venezuela is in?
Well, it would be simply the point that I made before, is some sort of rational mediation. I mean, it really is difficult to figure out these days. I mean, when you look at Maduro, who now seems to position an even more radical vice president, which means that the opposition, and the last thing they want to do is now run a recall to put in a more radical vice president. So everything, it is very hard to deal with the polarized situation. I guess the ultimate way is to try to put sort of a dialogue together, continued sort of multilateral pressure. The United States obviously can't forge a unity there. Bring in a panel of experts who sort of, obviously the regime doesn't want to turn to the IMF, but somebody's got to step in to sort of into this mess and try to come up with some sort of coherent plan, drawing upon the principles that have been outlined, change of exchange rates, overhaul of the oil industry so that you're putting more money back into production and future development. Mature heads, not Maduro heads, but mature heads have to sort of prevail, and that really is the only way you're going to get there. Throwing out the Chavistas is only going to create a sort of a complete undercutting of the opposition and internal sabotage movement. So it is not an easy, it is a Gordian knot of the worst sort to cut through.
Dr. Walser, do you have a question for Dr. Hetland?
Let's see. What do you feel the sense of, one of the concerns is, and you've mentioned this, is sort of corruption and the linkages between corruption and the military, because the military, even in your writings, seem to be, we talked about the bad old days of coups and everything like that, but yet we see a substantial sort of militarization of society, the resort of using the military in all sorts of government positions. So how do you see the role of the military and the potential that they become the kingmakers in Venezuela?
Yeah, I think you've hit the head on the nail in a sense. I think the military is playing a really onerous role currently in Venezuela's crisis. All signs point to them as a major, if not the major, source of corruption. And I think the way to tackle that issue is actually more, not less socialism, more sort of true socialism in the sense of genuine organized communities that are exerting real control. So some of the folks that I talked to in my recent trips to Venezuela talked about sort of participatory control over food distribution, which is one way of tackling the military corruption. When you have 200 people getting together and having detailed books and really talking about who has the most need, it's much harder to do corruption than when you have backroom deals between the military, other state officials, and private companies as well. So I think it's a difficult issue, but I think that giving more power not to the state and not to political parties, but to ordinary citizens in really sort of direct community control manner is the necessary step to fighting against this sort of overt control that the military has right now.
All right, and now it's time for We Agree, where each guest names something that the other has said that he or she agrees with. Who'd like to start?
Well, I'll go. I can go first. I think, I like the idea of people controlling their own destinies. I don't think that there's anything that a conservative says that the people's voice should count, that the people who are at the sort of the receiving end, the grassroots. I mean, today we just inaugurated a president who says, the politicians are no longer going to rule. We're going to listen to the people in the grassroots. He's obviously coming from a certain side. But agreement is that power belongs with the people. It belongs with the power of the vote, the power to sort of control their own destiny, the power to root out corruption and everything like that. So, and I totally agree that particularly when you talk about principles of socialism as principles of equity, of human dignity, of human rights, I think that those are things that everyone must respect. And so, in that sense of socialist principles, I'm not in disagreement.
Dr. Hetland, is there anything that you agree with that Dr. Walser's mentioned?
Yeah, absolutely. A number of points he's made I certainly agree with, but I think one of the really important points he made was about the dependent economies that many Latin American countries have, the dependence on basic commodities or a single commodity, in the case of Venezuela being oil. I think that that's been a sort of crippling to the region and makes it very, very difficult to generate any sort of sustainable, progressive, or revolutionary change for that matter. So I think coming up with strategies for overcoming that dependence, diversifying economies, breaking out of the sort of grips of being so in thrall to the ups and downs of the global economy is a really important piece of the puzzle. And I think we also need to have historical knowledge of that. A lot of this dependence does come from the sort of subordinate nature of colonialism, going back decades or hundreds of years in various cases. So they're not recent problems, but I think that when Ray's talking about the commodity dependent, it's a really, really critical issue, and we have to think about that.
Okay, that's all we have time for. We'd like to thank Dr. Gabriel Hetland of the State University of New York at Albany and Latin America policy analyst Dr. Ray Walser for joining us to discuss this issue.
Thank you very much, Donna.
Yeah, thank you very much, Donna and Ray. Pleasure speaking to you.
Equally to you, Gabriel.
And thank you for watching Scholars Mate. I'm Donna Davis. We'll see you next time.